Well, hi, everybody. Again, welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Luke Szyrmer. He is the founder of Launch Tomorrow. He helps new technology products get to market faster, even if you're working remotely. And his website is www.launchtomorrow.com. Luke is the author of the books Align Remotely and Launch Tomorrow, and he's the host of the highly rated podcast Managing Remote Teams. So look for that podcast wherever you're listening to this one. He comes from a product management background. He has a BA in economics and English from the University of Pennsylvania. He's coming to us today from Poland. So while it's morning for me, good afternoon to you, Luke. How are you today?
Very good, very good. I'm excited to speak to you today. And it's definitely quite warm, a warm day here. So,
yeah. Well, thank you for joining us. And there's a lot to cover today. I think there's an interesting intersection between the work you do and some interests of mine around entrepreneurship and metrics and process behavior charts. And so that's music to my ears when we started having some conversation about process behavior charts. But first off, in terms of backgrounds, I usually like to ask guests a bit of an origin story question of, how did you first get introduced to methods related to improvement, whether you want to frame that as Agile or lean startup or other methods, or maybe it's an amalgamation of all of those. Tell us a little bit about how you got started with this type of work.
Yeah, I kind of fell into it out of an interest in especially early stage innovation, but in general, new product development. I think that kind of so-called originally called fuzzy side of innovation, like that especially kind of 20, 30 years ago when I was getting started, it was just always cited as this kind of black hole where lots of time would be wasted, basically. I think as I got more and more into specifically products, being kind of digging into exactly how teams produce features. This is of software, and then also from the other side, what features are worth producing in the first place. And those are the kind of the constant questions of a software product manager, certainly.
Yeah. So there's this question of do you want to do the wrong things more correctly? Building the wrong features or building the wrong product or building the wrong company in a better way, right? There's those key questions, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It, kind of minimizing that as much as possible. I mean, most of my time when I drifted into product was in financial technology, in a hedge fund environment, and when we were looking at our internal processes, I mean, this is going to the topic you mentioned of process behavior charts. When we were looking at our processes of how we were making software, I think the way that it was really useful to kind of dig into what was actually going on was looking at how the team managed to finish things over time, and that's kind of where we started exploring that. And I found your book, I think, originally via Eric Ries, and
he was kind enough to endorse the book.
Yeah, and absolutely loved it, as I've mentioned to you before.
Thank you.
And I mean, the tool itself is actually the way that I kind of immediately, or what felt like immediately got it, is that it's quite similar to relative strength indicators when looking at currencies, modeling how currencies. I mean, this is kind of typical, I guess, financial technology geek being excited.
I don't know about this, so tell us about that a little bit. You're looking at fluctuations in currencies and kind of trying to filter out signal versus noise.
It's using the same mental framework, but in a slightly different way. So basically, it's a way of forecasting what's going to be happening with exchange rates, but with the assumption that they revert to a mean.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of, in fact, the quote unquote expected behavior is that they're going to go back to the mean, and then they're only going to fluctuate within standard deviation bounds. So it's like, yeah, it's a slightly different tool, and yes, it actually probably is arguably a much more of a random process than some of the stuff you'd use a PBC for, but yeah, that's it, kind of it already. I had some sense of numerically how that would work out when I saw it, and yeah, I mean that's the main. Yeah, so I guess the main place where they came in handy is that. A couple of different projects where we had quite significant delivery pressure around a certain date, because that's tied with three other departments that have to coordinate a whole bunch of things with something being done by some date, and then a lot of focus on exactly how quickly work was being done, when it's going to be ready, and I think the risk, which I think you articulated brilliantly, was that if everyone's super focused on exactly how the team is doing, every little minor fluctuation of up and down suddenly makes everybody nervous.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, so it became this very easy way for me to be able to calm down various stakeholders that okay, it fell, but this is more or less to be expected. There's always going to be some natural fluctuation up and down, and I wouldn't be too concerned at this point. And
there's a point. I didn't really make this point too much in measures of success, but it's an old W. Edwards Deming point on this. He would use the term tampering, that when managers overreact, ask for explanation to the small fluctuations, the noise, the common cause variation, it tends to increase variation because of the responses then to that management or that micromanagement. And there's an irony there of people would say, well, I don't like the variation, but then they take actions that end up increasing variation. I wonder, have you seen that dynamic when it comes to some of these measures on productivity or on-time delivery?
Yeah, I can definitely kind of intuitively sense how that dynamic could kind of play out. Yeah, I mean, it's if nothing else, if there is too much variation in the eyes of a senior stakeholder, then you've got a lot more meetings, you've got a lot more discussions and brainstorms and all of that, and that's time not actually spent doing the work. It's time talking about the work. Which would, if anything, reduce productivity.
Well, I could see the cycle of, all those extra meetings are slowing down work, and then they see there's a problem, and then somebody has a mandate like no meetings for the next 2 weeks, and then productivity might soar, right?
Yeah. So there is a bunch of kind of interdependent things going on there, I think, which very much could affect, especially downward variability. So, yeah, definitely on that front.
Yeah, there's, I mean, when we talk about systems and, back to currencies for a minute, I mean, it seems like these exchange rates are outcomes of a system, and that system might be stable for a period of time, and sort of like a metric, a performance measure in an organization with the process behavior chart, it would tend to be fluctuating around an average, and we could predict that would continue to be true. But then here's the catch: unless the system changes.
Yeah.
And you might not be able to predict the system change. So like with currencies, if there were some sort of, world event or economic shock or something, then that tendency to fluctuate around a stable average might no longer be true. And so I wonder if those charts in whatever format would allow you to detect that signal sooner in a way that would be like financially advantageous. If you realize, okay, that assumption is no longer true, I should either buy more of that, or am I expecting it to shift upward or shift downward? Would I buy more of that currency, or or I don't know what decisions you would make, but it seems like there's a similar trap where knowing it's been stable and predictable for a period of time doesn't guarantee that
It's
that'll
going to continue.
right?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I remember from speaking with various people, I mean, this is mostly kind of serving hedge funds. I mean, they had this kind of catch-all term of like when all correlations go to one. So basically, all market assets
Yeah.
go in one direction.
Uh-huh.
And usually, kind of what happens is that at that point, almost all of the mathematical tools they have are useless. So it's almost like they have models to understand kind of the stable state, and then they need completely different models to understand what happens in these extreme, let's say, black swan type events, and model that and kind of do, for example, a common tool is a scenario analysis. So you replay a portfolio of exactly how it would have performed during, say, 9/11 or during just different world events which would affect markets. And there typically it's not about the currency jumping outside of the one standard deviation. It's about completely throwing it out the window.
Right.
So yeah, it's a very different way of thinking about it at that point.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about, you used a phrase earlier, processes for creating software, and I'm getting that, probably not for this audience, but for some people they might cringe at that thought. What do you mean a process for creating software? So when it comes to process and software, and is you would read about, let's say, quote unquote, lean manufacturing. I'm curious, what resonated with you? How did you see that relating to software development or entrepreneurship?
So I think the biggest shift that's really helped in that context. So the main unit of measure is something that we call a story point in the software world, which is, it's kind of it's a measure of complexity. So basically the amount of mental effort needed to be made to create something, because unlike manufacturing, there's no manufacturing cost or distribution cost. Once it's built, that's pretty much all the costs you're going to have. So it's all about managing that, and then also making sure that you're building things which are valuable, that are most immediately valuable. So yeah, so going back to what I did find most interesting, I think I really liked in Womack's book Lean Thinking this description of different ways of organizing a bicycle factory, of like either you think about planning out a whole order as this big multi-stage project, or you just come up with a way of measuring how do you and reorganizing the work around minimizing the amount of time it takes to create one bike, and then doing it that way. And I think from a process perspective, it's kind of a mind twister, but it's extremely helpful at making the work visible to as an early warning signal if something's going wrong, and works just as well remotely as it does in an office. And it obviously takes a little bit of effort to do that, but to reorganize the work that way. But that's one thing that's super helpful. And then the other bit that you kind of got for free after organizing things that way was something that wasn't in the traditional, let's say, agile, well, now traditional agile way of thinking. Tax time, I think, is a super interesting concept, where you quantify demands in terms of a rate as opposed to a final outcome. Particularly when it comes to managing, even if it's relative to internal stakeholder expectations. If they're expecting you to do, create something really complicated in 2 months, it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to say that you're expecting us to go at the rate of 170 story points a week, and our current rate is 30. So it's like at that point, it's much more quantitatively precise. I mean, the other question is whether it's accurate.
Well, I was going to ask. I was going to ask a follow up and explore that. Where this is where I would wonder about the translation of this. So, like, let's say with cars. Mm-hmm. That's easily countable. It's very discrete. It's very repetitive. You'd say the market demand is 60 seconds. A new car is purchased. Like, that's very straightforward. I would guess customers don't talk in terms of story points. They wouldn't say, I want a 2-week tack time on new features. And then it seems they might say that. I don't know. But it seems like, the story points, it's both an abstraction and an estimate. And I wonder, are there different ways where that can get off track?
It's a story point is a unit of measure in the same way it's a kilogram or a meter or something like that. Sorry, a pound or a mile.
It's okay. We can speak metric here. It's okay.
And then in those units of measure, you can estimate, you can then measure how much was actually delivered, you can plan, you can express attack time. So it's used in different ways, I think. Actually, so from the calculation in terms of tack time is actually very similar, because it's about the breaking up the overall demand at the end into some kind of a rate. So the overall demand is the same. It's just a question of a rate, and then you can just express it in story points as opposed to cars. It's numerical.
But again, like, it seems like there's this estimate element where, like, back when I started my career in the automotive industry, when work is very discrete and very repetitive. General Motors at the time had these, work estimation tools that were very, very precise to be able to, even before going and testing something in practice on the, in the manufacturing shop, that, okay, here's a job that could be done in 55 seconds based on how much motion and how much turning and how much weight was being lifted. But then when we get into more the abstract realm, we're not dealing with things that can be directly measured, like mass or so I wonder, I always think that maybe this is the cynic in me of thinking of the dysfunctions of, is there incentive for people to overstate the story points? Well, you want me to follow this user story and develop this new feature. Well, I think it's a large number of story points. And then some manager might say, well, no. I think that's actually fewer story points. How would you know, or how would you assign that story point number?
So there's a standard tool called planning poker. So essentially, you're using the dynamics of poker, and this is kind of backed up in software engineering research, that this very much does help reduce this type of gamesmanship that you're talking about after the fact. The key is to try and expose that up front when you're planning. And usually the way it works is that when you've got a particular unit of work, a story, a task, whatever you want to call it, the team who's actually going to do it discuss it amongst themselves. And then, in order to not influence one another, they vote with a number to estimate roughly how many story points they think it is. What level of complexity it is relative to all the other work being discussed, let's say, that day, but also relative to everything they've done in the past. And yes, it's very abstract. It's definitely not a bicycle or a car. But really, when we do have these planning estimation sessions, I'd say 70% of the time, you'd be surprised. All of the developers vote the same thing, despite not being influenced by one another. And it's uncanny. It's especially with bigger things, because with little ones, okay, it's little. Everyone agrees it's little, but like once it's big, that's where you can have the potential differences. And in fact, the whole point of story poker isn't so much the voting; it's the discussions to talk about the variance, to figure out overall as a team, what the right estimate is. And the key is that it's done before you start the work, first of all. And second of all, the estimation isn't done by the managers, it's done by the people doing the work.
Yeah.
In a relatively low, ideally low pressure situation.
Yeah, right. It seems like you would want to eliminate fear and other dysfunctions that would lead to gamesmanship or people sandbagging or whatever term you use. But yeah, I mean, I'm reminded, I'm thinking of different times when you would try to use a little bit of wisdom of the crowd of looking for estimates. Like I've seen discussion around asking people, even in a healthcare setting, without going out and measuring, which would maybe be better. But let's say if there's certain tasks that don't happen very often, so there's not an opportunity to go actually measure it, and you would ask people, how long does it take to do X? You might remove an outlier at each end of those estimates, because sometimes people are just bad at remembering or estimating. Maybe eliminate the outliers, and then you see, well, okay, there's kind of some consensus there that might be good enough until you can go test that assumption or test that hypothesis in reality.
Yeah, exactly. It's enough to be useful. Like it doesn't need to be precisely down to the 6th decimal point, as long as it's the right, let's say, not quite a little bit less than order of magnitude, but as long as it's in the right area, it's enough to get going. And then there's also a cost to spending more time estimating to get more precision. So that's the other side. So you want enough estimation for it to be useful, but not so much that you spend a week estimating and planning. And whereas you could just be doing things, prototyping, building something, that kind of thing. So
you mentioned the book Lean Thinking. It seems like there's a bit of a parallel when you talk about the design of a factory. Womack and others would write about a departmental factory layout, functional layout of all the welding machines are in one area, all of the cutting machines are in another, all the and so then things would almost by necessity, kind of burp along through the system in batches, right? Because of these long distances. It doesn't, one piece flow wouldn't make sense to somebody who has to carry a bicycle frame a long distance. You're going to accumulate a large metal basket full of frames and then move the basket. But then, I think the one key insight of lean thinking is to have a flow-based layout, or have production cells, or even just have whatever the sequence of operations would be. One cutter, one grinder, one welder, and just then you could have one piece flow because the machines are like literally right next to each other. Yeah. It seems like then there are parallels to software where people can think about reducing batches and thinking of the functional departments in software might be back in the day of collecting requirements, building the software, testing the software. Like that used to be almost like just people thought, well, it had to be a large batch process, right? Can you talk, I'm curious your perspectives then on some of that evolution of moving toward flow within the design of a software system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the overall change that I've seen kind of since the 90s is that before it was very kind of functional, long-term stages of first, like you say, collecting requirements and then going through various stages, and then finally, in the end, something goes out to the client. Now I think that the move has been very much towards having a cross-functional team. So everything needed to produce one unit of software is within one team.
Yeah.
And then it's just a question of how they cooperate amongst each other. And in practice, the way that I've managed to, let's say, work on something like waste is mostly, quantifying the time between stages. So basically, at the team level, how long does a particular story or task stay in a waiting state between each, let's say, not quite functional area anymore because it's specific people or specific groups of people within a team that are going to be handling something. And you can very much can apply that in a software context. I mean, I had one project where we went down from, like an overall cycle time of like 3.5 weeks down to 37 hours, where, of course, after doing a whole bunch of improvements, identifying changes in infrastructure, changes in all kinds of tooling, writing code that helps write documentation, like all kinds of different more or less insane ways of speeding things up, and it, you know, and it really did help quite a bit. And I think the fact that it was kind of an observable collectible measure made it helpful. And yeah, I think it definitely shocked everyone that when we first started, like the ratio of the amount of time that the tasks would be in a waiting state was like multiple times of what the actual work time was. And in that context, sitting on someone's neck that, you know, why did you spend so much time developing this and that, is kind of irrelevant, because it's not going to be done anyway, like because of all these process inefficiencies. So that's kind of the direction that it's gone, I'd say.
Yeah. And one other thing I was going to ask you, curious if this has moved in a better direction, or how you mentioned when we first started talking here. I thought it was an interesting phrase I hadn't heard, the fuzzy side of innovation, thinking back 20, 30 years ago. Do you think through different methods, including what we've learned from Steve Blank and Eric Ries and others, like are organizations wasting less time when it comes to innovation? Is it less fuzzy because we're better at testing hypotheses and instead of making assumptions? It might be hard to generalize, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a lot on individual companies, but I think on the whole, there's a whole grab bag of analytical tooling to help break down something that would before be largely an intuitive process amongst a group of people, kind of the kind of skunkworks environment. Lock them in a dark room and tell them to go figure it out. At least in a corporate context, startups pretty much do that themselves.
Yeah.
Or in a garage, right? Right. Location is slightly different, but same idea. And I think basically applying a more quantitative approach and a feedback loop approach. I think that's what's certainly changed for me relative to the stuff that I would have read in college around innovation in the late 90s, for example.
Yeah. So then there's innovation in how we go about innovation, and hopefully these new practices or even new ideas that are being developed now are framed as some sort of hypothesis. We have a theory, and I think this is like a really fundamental mindset, just even to bring it back to the work that I'm most involved in around continuous improvement, that there's a huge difference in mindset between saying, I have an idea. I know this is a good idea. I know it's going to work. Like that mindset can get you in a lot of trouble, even with the smallest of changes in a workplace, as opposed to saying, I've got an idea. What needs to be true for this to work? What assumptions am I making? How do I test this idea? It might not be a good idea. Like, kind of the honest recognition of some of those things. I think maybe sometimes easier said than done. That people could go and study lean startup and different methods and still fall into the I know my idea is a good one trap.
Yeah, there's some kind of individual personality thing going on there when it happens, I think, and to some extent there is a little bit of a, let's say, structured thinking / numerical skills, particularly for the more kind of like experiment construction or something. There's some people get it right away. I mean, I've run workshops for people, like open workshops on this topic, and then like half of the people there just obviously immediately get it, and then there's some that are just like really struggling with with certain things simply because they don't feel confident enough in their math skills. So there's a bit of that. Yeah, I mean, I think my favorite one is the landing page testing. I think so. So with landing page testing, essentially what you're doing is you're putting up a web page which describes a product or a service which either doesn't exist yet, or you're planning to release. You've got, for example, a release date or something like that, and structuring the interaction that way. Either at the level of a startup where the whole company doesn't exist and it's kind of a one product company, or as a kind of off-brand exercise for a larger company where they just want to see how the market would react. And essentially what you're doing is you're creating a kind of a structured way to test numerically what the kind of market structure is, what the demand is for something. And there's a couple of parts there. So one thing is what's on the actual landing page and what the thing is, what the value proposition is, but it's also what segment are you going after? What channels you use to reach them. I mean, there's different subparts there, and essentially you're trying to get this initial match between a group of people that actually really want one thing before you do anything else, and or at least relatively early on in the process, or for example in parallel as you're working on it. Like I know in healthcare, it's definitely a lot more complicated. I mean, I've worked with medical device startups or something where, yeah, I mean, it's one thing to test demand. It's another thing where you're talking about things which are clearly tied to people's health and So there's. I think you just need to be really careful in terms of making sure that you aren't doing something that's going to hurt someone, or that is make sure it's okay from a regulatory perspective.
Right.
But then there's even before you do a full landing page test, there's a number of different types of tests you can run before that. So, for example, a really common issue, especially with tech startup founders, I mean, I work a lot with that kind of like engineering type founders, is that they came up with some widget, which they think is amazing, but because they're so close to it, it's difficult for them to articulate it in a way that is easy to understand for someone. Sure. And if someone doesn't understand what the product that's being pitched is, they're definitely not going to buy it.
Right.
So I think this is more of like a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition. They have to understand in order to want to buy it. But if you're trying to enter a market, and if your marketing communication is completely unclear, then clearly you're going to get a false signal. Even it might still be a great idea, but if you can't articulate it, then who cares? And there's a number of ways to do that. Partially, I mean, the best is directly with customers. Just pull up a web page on a tablet and get feedback from them, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or there's different kind of tools originally meant for, let's say, in like a more of a UX context, where they can quantitatively measure how visually clear the layout of a particular landing page is, or or looking at the attractiveness of the headline or something like that. Right. And this stuff is important not only in the context of testing an idea, but I think also like when you are creating something new, I think it's not just that act of 0 to 1 creating something, but it's especially for a startup, like its landing page is like the 21st century equivalent of a business card, right? Like this is you're kind of testing your identity to some extent,
right?
And getting that clear and understandable for a particular group. Like there's a lot of testing you can do around that.
Well, it seems like I wonder if anyone ever did this with business cards, but A/B testing or testing and evaluating different alternatives. I don't know if people ever tested like, okay, I have two different business cards and I'm going to hand them out to people and see which card leads to the most follow-up calls. Like you could do that in real life, maybe, right?
I mean, it sounds like something like a old school direct marketer would do, to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
honest.
yeah,
Or they'd have a couple of versions and then they'd go to a big event and then just see who have
yeah,
a different phone number on each one and then see which one's called or that kind of thing.
yeah.
So
Yeah, so it seems like there's that trap of somebody, again, this difference of saying, I know this landing page is good. I know that headline is good versus I have a hypothesis. Let's test something or let's test a couple things in parallel. And hopefully you have enough data points to make a good decision. But I know one thing that you've worked on and thought about is, how do we make good decisions if we have a small number of data points?
yeah, so this is I mean this is kind of the classic problem with numerical tools
Mhm.
in early stage innovation because you can't you can't necessarily afford to do kind of a large scale corporate survey or something like that to get a full picture. But yeah, I mean, I think the two numbers that I find the most useful are 5 and 30. So 5 is kind of this rule of thumb in terms of just qualitative exploration of ideas, where if you go and do five interviews with different people in a market, probably you'll get I mean, you'll definitely learn something every single time, and that every time I've done that or worked with teams, that's always the case,
Mhm.
relative to what you knew going into before you did the interviews. And also, the actual core idea of something that's super valuable is somewhere in that qualitative data set of stuff that you've heard.
Mhm.
And then when you're ready to start thinking about testing, then it's a question of what's let's say operationally feasible. Like the smallest sample size where you can start reasoning statistically is probably around 30.
Mhm.
And yeah, so you can go and have that many interviews with with people on the street if you're doing a consumer product or something like that. But yeah, so that gives you something. And then the good thing about having a somewhat smaller sample size is that you can run a lot more experiments with the same
Mm.
number of potential observations.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yes, it's not as precise and definitive, but at the same time, on the flip side, you can have a much greater variety of
Mhm.
experiments and much
Yeah.
more robust learning when
Yeah.
you're entering a new market.
Yeah. And it seems like when you're evaluating, let's say, a landing page response rate over time, there's a time series. There's time series data. There's a metric. You could apply a process behavior chart to that to avoid the situation of saying, the response rate fell from 14% to 12%. Let's go do a root cause analysis. Like, well, that number might be fluctuating around an average.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think at this stage you're very much getting into the realm of traditional conversion rate optimization, which
Mm-hmm.
is more of kind of like at this point an established
Mm-hmm.
way of looking at it from a marketing perspective in an
Mm-hmm.
established company.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas let's say the startup view of landing pages is a little bit different in
Mm-hmm.
that you aren't optimizing a sales process that already
Mm-hmm.
exists, which is what
Right.
CRO does. You're trying to nail what it is that you want to offer in the first place. so,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that's slightly different way of thinking about it.
Yeah. But it seems like there would be a flow of different hypotheses baked into even putting a landing page out there of, first, can people find the page?
Mm-hmm.
Are people interested in learning more? Would they signal like, yes, I would actually buy this? Like saying I would buy it versus actually buying it is different. And then, hopefully you've already sorted out the question of can you deliver it? Like you were talking earlier about healthcare, and I was starting to think through if Elizabeth Holmes had started with a landing page for Theranos, A lot of
In
people
fact,
would have said, yeah, bring it on. I want all these lab tests done with a drop of blood, but that wasn't the issue. She never delivered, the company never delivered on
what
that
she was saying.
promise. Right.
Yeah,
Just never
exactly.
worked. But Luke, there's a lot. We're running a little short on time here, so there's a lot more that we could discuss, but I think we'll have to sort of leave it at this today. But I do want to mention again, your most recent book launched tomorrow. Take your product, startup, or business from idea to launch in one day. If you want to learn more about landing page minimum viable products and measuring and evaluating things there, testing ideas as hypotheses. There's a lot to explore there. So again, the website for Luke's company is launchtomorrow.com, and then the podcast is Managing Remote Teams. Now, a question on the podcast, is that something that you had been exploring and talking about well before the pandemic, or was this a pandemic adjustment?
It was admittedly a pandemic adjustment. I think when I saw a lot of things, the initial reaction when I saw a lot of the content showing up online around remote work, I felt was kind of obviously the first initial thing, like what types of tools do you need and all of that. But having worked with remote software teams for quite a while, I felt the real questions were probably 3 or 4 levels deeper, and I didn't really that was what I wanted to explore in the podcast, basically. So
Managing Remote Teams, so people will check that out, because I'm sure, Luke, you're working with people every day, and in how many different time zones?
At the moment, not very many, but yes, I've worked with people across 13 time zones in the past, and there's ways of doing it, but if you can avoid it, obviously that's better. So
there's remote, and then there's globally remote, like how remote?
Distributed, yeah.
But Luke, thank you for the discussion today. Thanks for sharing some of your thoughts and perspectives around innovation and software. And I think there are transferable lessons learned in all directions. And I appreciate you sharing with me privately and talking a little bit here today about your use of process behavior charts in that realm. So I do appreciate you doing that and sharing that and being here as a guest today.
Thank you, Mark.